The history of the 20th century in Arab nations features unique figures. This ancient land, from the temples of Mesopotamia to the pyramids of Giza, has had a history full of glories, romances, wars, and tragedies. Such is the case of the figures we are going to learn about today: Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and Gamal Abdel Nasser. They are leaders who, revered by some and rejected by others, left an indelible mark not only on their respective countries, but also on the rest of the world. Today we'll explore their remarkable biographies. This is Alejandro Andrade, and this is the New Encyclopedia.
Saddam Hussein was born on April 28, 1937, in a very poor village on the banks of the Tigris River, 160 kilometers from Baghdad, the capital of what was then the Kingdom of Iraq. His Muslim family was of the Sunni faith. In Iraq at that time, about 1/3 of Muslims were Sunnis, and 2/3 of them were Shiites. His father and his brother died shortly before he was born, which plunged his mother into a deep depression, which led her to leave young Saddam in the care of his uncle, Jalal Tulfa, a devout Sunni teacher and army officer, who instilled in him many of his anti-colonial, nationalist, and anti-communist political ideas. Iraq is a region with a millennia-old history, where the supposedly first known civilization was born with the Sumerian cities in ancient Mesopotamia. It was a center for various empires and a battleground for rival empires and tribal clans, dominated for centuries by the Ottoman Empire. At the end of World War I, the territory came under British occupation. The Kingdom of Iraq was proclaimed with a pro-British Iraqi monarch, and Mosul was annexed to the newly formed Iraqi state after its oil wealth became known. 13 years later, in 1932, the Kingdom of Iraq was admitted as a supposedly sovereign nation into the League of Nations. While the British maintained a military presence, great influence over the government, and control of the oil industry, an already old Arab nationalism continued to grow in Iraq. This is the monarchical Iraq in which Saddam Hussein would be born. This period was also marked by constant uprisings and clashes for political reasons with ethnic and tribal overtones. A region where political conflicts were and still are settled by force. It was in one of these uprisings in Iraq, the nationalist coup of 1941, that Saddam's uncle, Jalal Tulfa, took part. This coup led to a new British invasion that crushed the nationalists, restored the monarchy, and left Hussein's uncle behind bars. Saddam, which in Arabic means the one who confronts, he had to return to his mother's house, where she had remarried and had more children, who would mistreat and abuse Saddam. While he was herding goats and was denied the opportunity to attend school, still he was a very sociable child. At the age of 10, Saddam ran away from his mother's house to return to his uncle when he was released. He guided him toward a political career that would lead him to become one of the most condemned leaders in contemporary history. After barely graduating, he moved with his adoptive family to Baghdad, where he failed to enter the military academy or join Baghdad's academic and cultural circles. At that time, there was a strong feeling against British and American intervention and against the Iraqi monarchy. Saddam takes this in and further separates from his Muslim roots. There, in 1957, he joins the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, known as the Ba'ath Party, a secular nationalist revolutionary organization. It adheres to Arab socialism, which should not be confused with Western Marxist socialism, since it does not believe in class struggle or the seizure of the means of production. The party also supported Pan-Arabism, the political union of Arab peoples worldwide. It started as a small party, but within a few years, it would govern longer than any other. In 1958, a group of officers overthrew and executed King Faisal II and his family, and installed General Abdul Karim Qasim in power. This marked the end of the monarchy in Iraq, and the republic was declared under a nationalist and Arab socialist government. The Ba'ath Party initially rose as a key government ally, but soon became enemies over disagreements about Pan-Arabism and Ba'athism. Is it banned? Saddam, a man with a fierce attitude, was tasked by the Ba'ath Party to carry out an assassination on October 2, 1959. A group that included Saddam tried to machine gun the leader of the Iraqi government, but Hussein was wounded by a gunshot. Sentenced to death, he decided to flee and go into exile in Syria for several years before moving to Egypt. Meanwhile, his accomplices were arrested and executed. In Syria, he is welcomed by Ba'athism founder Michel Aflaq. He leaves Syria for Egypt in February, staying from 1960 to 1963 under the protection of the president of Egypt, the famous Gamal Abdel Nasser, a great promoter of Pan-Arabism and Arab socialism. There he would marry his cousin and first wife, who gives him his two sons, Uday and Qusay. During his stay in Egypt, he continues his political activities and cultivates a network of relationships that allows him to learn from the experience of Gamal Abdel Nasser. He learned all he could, and eager to bring those ideas to Iraq, seized the opportunity when power aligned. The Ba'athist and Nasserist military officers in the government of General Abdul Karim Qasim overthrow him in February of 1963, and they put Abdul Salam at the head of the Iraqi government. Arif Hassan al-Bakr, a senior member of the Ba'ath Party with family ties to Saddam, thus becomes the vice president and prime minister of Iraq. Saddam returns to serve the new government, and Hassan al-Bakr appoints him to a position where he demonstrates political organizational skills. Saddam establishes a paramilitary security force under his control, expanding intelligence, internal security, and targeting communists and other dissidents. But less than a year later, the newly appointed president, Abdul Salam, would purge from his government the same Ba'athists who had brought him to power, including Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam's relative, who is stripped of his position. Saddam stayed loyal to al-Bakr due to their blood ties and was also arrested. 2 years later, he manages to escape from prison and goes underground to organize a Ba'athist militia. In 1968, these militias of Saddam were key in a coup orchestrated by his Ba'athist relative, Hassan al-Bakr, which overthrew the president of Iraq. Finally, the Ba'ath Party came to power on its own. Hassan al-Bakr is appointed president, and Saddam, who had earned the trust of the party, is appointed vice president of Iraq and head of the Revolutionary Command. The Ba'athists were determined this time not to lose power again. Saddam is tasked with organizing the new regime's intelligence and security, and he immediately sends some high-ranking military officers who were not Ba'athists into exile. And he begins a policy of persecution against communists, monarchists, and other dissident groups. At 31 years old, Saddam was already at the peak of Iraqi power and little by little became the de facto leader of the country, even though Hassan al-Bakr was the nominal president, the new government in which Saddam was the number 2. Leading efforts in both internal and external politics, he carries out a campaign of literacy and mass education in Iraq, being awarded by United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. An ambitious infrastructure plan is developed. A new constitution is approved, giving women voting rights and access to property and education. Iraq's universal healthcare and hospital network have been expanded, and oil industry development is encouraged. Accompanying this developmental policy was a strict policy of control, surveillance, and persecution against both external and internal dissidents, as well as Shiites and Kurds. This allowed Hussein to consolidate himself as the true de facto leader and stabilize the new regime. He also began to include members of his Tikrit family clan in the state apparatus. Iraq's vast oil fields were central to his political strategy, Saddam is the main driving force behind the nationalization of the Iraqi oil company in 1972. A year later, world oil prices skyrocketed. After the oil nationalization, Iraq's oil revenues increased 40-fold in less than 10 years. Iraq became one of the world's leading oil exporters, and the country's economic development showed unprecedented growth rates. The government of al-Bakr and Hussein made an effort to diversify the economy, and they implemented a national campaign for infrastructure, which achieved great progress in road construction, mining promotion, and the development of other industries. The campaign contributed to the energy industries as well. Electricity was brought to almost all cities in Iraq and many rural areas. In 1972, 4 years after Baathism took power, a cooperation and friendship treaty was signed with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, relationships with Syria, Iran, and Egypt were complex and shifting, while ties with Israel, accused of being Zionist, remained uncompromising. After the 1973 oil crisis, France adopted a pro-Arab policy and was rewarded by Saddam with closer relations. France provided Iraq with the infrastructure and uranium needed to develop its ambitious nuclear energy program. France named Iraq's first nuclear reactor Osirak. However, this reactor was destroyed on June 7, 1981 by an Israeli airstrike. In the middle of the Iraq-Iran war, which we will talk about later, Hussein and his party always maintained, to a greater or lesser extent, a rhetoric against Israel and Zionism. Iraq was an extremely key state in the balance of power in the Middle East. Israel continued to see it as a very troublesome actor for its interest, especially from the 1990s onward. Numerous investigations suggest that one of the main reasons for the last United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the protection of Israel, in addition to safeguarding the dollar as the only currency for oil sales. But we'll talk more about this later. In the 70s, Saddam Hussein continued internal and external political roles, negotiating an agreement with Iran that included Iraqi border concessions. In exchange, Iran agreed to stop supporting the Kurds who opposed Saddam's government in Iraq. Because of the government's rapid achievements during the 70s, in 1975, the Spanish ruler Francisco Franco awarded Saddam Hussein the Order of Isabella the Catholic. In 1976, Saddam became a general in the Iraqi armed forces. As the sick and elderly Hassan al-Bakr became unable to carry out his duties as president, he remained in the shadow of the de facto leader, Saddam Hussein. By 1979, there were reports that President al-Bakr was planning to appoint the Syrian president, Hafez al-Assad, as his successor and thus unify both countries. But Saddam acted to prevent this and secure his control, and forced the ailing al-Bakr to resign on July 16, 1979, in order to formally assume the presidency. It was the country's fifth leadership change in 21 years, but the first without dramatic circumstances. After becoming president, Saddam Hussein gathers Ba'ath Party leaders on July 22, 1979. During the assembly, which he ordered to be recorded on video, Saddam claimed to have found a fifth column within the Ba'ath Party. They were accused of supporting the Syrian leader against Iraqi interests. And he forced one of those involved to read a confession of having participated in this conspiracy and to read the names of the 68 conspirators. These members were removed from the room individually and arrested. After reading the list, Saddam congratulated those who were still sitting in the room for their past and future loyalty. The people who were arrested were tried for treason, and by August 1, 1979, hundreds of high-ranking members of the Ba'ath Party had been executed. During his rule, Saddam Hussein promoted Iraqi Arab nationalism, emphasizing a strong Iraq and exalting ancient Mesopotamia. He even had his party publish a family tree connecting him to Saladin Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and the Prophet Muhammad's family. Saddam's personality cult became pervasive in Iraqi society. There were thousands of portraits, statues, and murals with his image all over the streets. That same year, near Iraq, Saddam became president. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 in Iran, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, replaced the Iranian monarchy with a Shiite-style Islamic republic. This Iranian revolution and its political Islamism were seen by the United States and Israel as a major threat to their interests in the region. In addition to this, Saddam feared that the influence of Iranian revolutionary Shiism would spread among his majority Shiite population in Iraq. In line with Hussein's expansionist policy and emboldened by the United States and other powers with interests in the region, Iraq launched a war against Iran on the grounds that Iran had denied Iraq access to the sea. Iraq got weapons and logistical help from France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, plus financial support from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. They also opposed the expansion of Islamic fundamentalism from Iran. Although in this conflict, the United States would also secretly sell sophisticated weapons to Iran through Israel in the famous Iran-Contra scandal. Then the United States directly attacked key Iranian targets to put an end to the long struggle. This war unleashed a harsh 8-year military conflict in which there was no clear winner, nor were there any changes in the border agreements that sparked it. What there was, however, was around 1 million deaths on both sides, a socially and economically devastated Iraq and Iran, and a significantly weakened Iranian Muslim revolution. During the war, Hussein's government launched a violent campaign against Kurdish groups opposed to his regime and backed by Iran. International organizations report that more than 100,000 Kurds were killed in 3 years. What about Hussein's regime using chemical weapons? Chemical weapons that were developed and used with the support and approval of the United States. All this time, Saddam was not a criminal to the United States, but a very useful ally. On the other hand, the end of the war with Iran served to deepen the latent tensions that existed between Iraq and its wealthy neighbor in Kuwait. Saddam began to urge Kuwait to ease the debts that Iraq had accumulated with Kuwait during the war, around $30 billion. But Kuwait refused. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were producing more oil than Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries allowed, keeping prices low when Iraq needed high oil prices to pay its debt and rebuild its economy. But they still wouldn't give in. On the other hand, Saddam had consistently argued that Kuwait was a historically integral part of Iraq and that it only existed as a state, apart from the interference of the British government in its time, reaffirming a belief that Iraqi nationalism had supported for 50 years. Saddam discussed his plans to invade and annex Kuwait with the Bush senior administration when faced with this situation. The response was that the United States would not get involved, had no commitments to Kuwait, and would not take sides. In this way, on August 2, 1990, the government of Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and later annexed it as the 19th province of Iraq. In January 1991, contrary to what was previously stated, an international coalition led by the United States declared war on Iraq, and with Operation Desert Storm, in just a few weeks they forced Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait in what became known as the Gulf War, thus restoring the Emirate of Kuwait. This time, most of the dead, both military and civilian, were Iraqis, in addition to hundreds of thousands affected by the use of depleted uranium weapons by the United States. During the conflict, Iraq also launched missiles at cities in Israel, a reckless attempt to shift the war's momentum in response to attacks by Israel and Iraq in 1981. In the months before the so-called Gulf War, the West began its campaign to demonize Saddam Hussein. He went from being treated as an ally in the war against Iran and the Kurds to now being portrayed as the greatest threat in the Middle East. After Iraq's defeat in 1991, Saddam's challenge was to stay in power, which he managed to do without abandoning his defiant, irreverent, and sovereign attitude. As a result of the war, harsh sanctions were imposed on Iraq, demanding the country's disarmament, as well as a strong economic embargo, which only made its already disrupted economy worse. In turn, its army had been decimated, and for geopolitical reasons, the United States Army did not end up taking Baghdad so easily. In 1992, British and American planes burned crops in Iraq. The next year, Iraq was accused of plotting to assassinate George Bush Sr. and repeatedly violating the no-fly zones. Bill Clinton ordered 23 Tomahawk missiles launched at Baghdad's intelligence headquarters. By 1998, during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, the United States and United Kingdom bomb Iraq again, with the argument that Iraq refused to cooperate with the United Nations and for having evaded the imposed sanctions. Hussein, in response, takes measures aimed at replacing the petrodollar with the euro in his oil sales and transactions. And he takes other measures aimed at reducing United States influence in Iraq. In the 1990s, after a secular phase, Saddam Hussein started presenting himself as a devout Muslim, against those called traitors of the Arab nation. Sharia law elements returned, and Saddam's handwritten phrase Allahu Akbar, meaning God is great, was added to the national flag. Saddam also commissioned the production of a blood Quran, written with 27 leaders, allegedly of his own blood. After the Gulf War in the 1990s, Shia Muslims also experienced social and ethnic instability. The Kurds and dissident military units threatened the stability of Saddam's government. Uprisings broke out in the Kurdish north and in the central and southern parts of Iraq, but all of them were crushed by the government. After the Twin Towers fell on September 11, 2001, the true perpetrators remained debated. The rhetoric of the United States against Iraq began to grow more hostile, following constant claims that Iraq posed a threat. 2 years later, a United States-led coalition of countries, with key support from Israeli agents, they launched an invasion of Iraq on March 20th, 2003, with the argument that the Iraqi government possessed weapons of mass destruction and had also collaborated with the cells supposedly responsible for the September 11 attacks. However, both accusations turned out to be false and were never proven. During the pre-war debate in the United States, Iraq was seen as a threat that needed to be neutralized. On September 10, 2002, the executive director of the September 11 Attacks Commission and advisor to the United States Department of State, Philip David Sellico, said, "Why would Iraq attack the United States or use nuclear weapons against us? I'll tell you what I think the real threat has been since 1990. It's the threat against Israel." End quote. Just 3 weeks after the invasion, the United States-led coalition occupied much of Iraq, and the resistance of the weakened Iraqi army had collapsed or shifted to guerrilla tactics. On April 9th, 2003, Baghdad fell to the United States-led forces, symbolically marked by the toppling of the former dictator's statue. But no clues were found about his whereabouts for several weeks. On several occasions, Saddam released audio recordings promoting popular resistance to his ousting. At the same time, a provisional government was being installed in Iraq, controlled by the United States. In July 2003, his sons, Uday and Qusay, and his 14-year-old grandson, Mustafa, died in a 3-hour shootout with United States forces. On December 13, 2003, during Operation Red Dawn, Saddam was captured by United States forces after being found hiding in a hole near Tikrit, his hometown. In 2005, the trial against Saddam Hussein began, carried out by a court in Iraq under United States control. During the trial, one of Hussein's lawyers was killed in Baghdad, and others fled after threats. His charges were related to the murders committed during his rule against Kurds, Shiites, and other political leaders, as well as the invasion of Kuwait. Hussein appeared in court for invading Kuwait, stating he acted for the good of Iraq's people. How can you defend those dogs? The judge scolded him for his language and reminded him he was in court. But Saddam looked around with a half smile and said, "All of this is a theater. The real criminal is Bush." Finally, Saddam Hussein was sentenced to die by hanging. Upon receiving the sentence, Hussein repeatedly said the following words, "With the Quran in hand, long live Iraq, long live the Iraqis. Allah is greater than the invaders." Finally, he is hanged on December 30, 2006, after his execution. On that same day, a series of attacks shook Baghdad, leaving at least 70 dead. After the Ba'ath Party called on Iraqis to seek revenge for the assassination of the former president at the hands of the invaders, his body was handed over to his family to be buried in his hometown of Tikrit. Ultimately, the region saw neither democracy nor stability, just the opposite. Since the invasion, the country has faced ongoing political and social conflict. The guerrilla war against the American army has been brutal, waged by various groups opposing the occupation. The internal conflict between Shiites and Sunnis has also intensified, as well as between tribal clans, almost to the brink of civil war. Islamist groups like the Islamic State have also proliferated, bringing together many of Saddam's former supporters. The pro-American government, established by the invading coalition, lost much of its control over the territory to local militias. Hundreds of thousands have died since the occupation, and the conditions for Iraqis have worsened as Iran has expanded its influence in the region. All of this has resulted in a significant cult of personality around Saddam Hussein still persisting in Iraq, seen as the strongman who returned Iraq to its prominent place in international politics and as a martyr of the invasion. In a nation that was a colony for almost the entire 20th century, the truth is that his figure is much more multifaceted as a stabilizer and developer during the rule of Hassan al-Bakr, as a bloody warmonger and servant to foreign powers during the 10 years of war that Iraq entered during his rule, and as an anti-colonialist willing to die before giving up his territory. Violent, shrewd, and determined, his mark will remain engraved in the Middle East for a long time. Muammar Gaddafi was born in Sirte and raised in Italian-occupied Libya. We know little about his childhood. The son of a Sunni Muslim herdsman, he studied the Quran as a child and did not receive formal education until age 10. Since childhood, he heard stories of Libyan fighters who resisted foreign invasions in the early 20th century. He grew resentful of foreigners because Italians killed his grandfather and tortured his father during the fight against Italian colonization. Libya, as it's known today, is a vast territory about 5 times the size of Italy. Since before Christ, it was home to Phoenician and Greek settlements and later became part of the Roman Empire. In the 7th century AD, it was conquered by Muslim Arabs, and the territory became Islamic. In 1551, it came under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and in 1910, the territory was then colonized by Italy with a harsh 10-year war, until Italy was defeated in World War II and handed the territory over to France and England. The Allies decided to form what we now know as the Libyan state, founded in 1951 as the Kingdom of Libya, when Gaddafi was 9. This was the first African colony to legally achieve the status of an independent country. However, it was a fragile country with little capacity for self-governance, and under the monarchy, there continued to be a great deal of Anglo-Saxon and Saudi Arabian influence. When Gaddafi entered school, his classmates made fun of him because of his Bedouin origin, which is a particular Arab subgroup of desert nomads. For a long time, he stayed away from home and slept in the mosque. At some point in the 1950s, his family moved from Sirte to an arid and desert area of Libya. That was when Gaddafi became interested in politics. He began political activism, and for the next 10 years, he started planning the overthrow of the government of King Idris of Libya. By the early 1950s, Gamal Abdel Nasser's influence in Egypt strongly impressed him, leading him to emulate Nasser's Pan-Arabist, anti-Zionist, and anti-colonial views. Nasser was one of the main exponents of so-called Arab socialism, a movement that led anti-colonial governments in countries like Iraq, Syria, Algeria, and South Yemen. It was a diverse movement, more or less secular and socialist in nature, that sought the unification of the Arab world. By the time oil exploitation began in Libya, British and American companies took charge of the extraction activities. An economic boom began in the country, but Libyans' living conditions did not improve. Charismatic, inspiring, and astute, Gaddafi attracted many followers through his activism and organized numerous protests in the 1960s and 1970s. By 1963, at 21, he joins the military academy and encourages his followers to do the same, aiming to later seize power with weapons. At the Benghazi Military Academy, he encounters many officers who drank, gambled, and did not lead a peaceful life in accordance with the Muslim faith, which deeply bothers him. He and his followers start an underground resistance that steadily gains support. During military training, he kills rivals, tortures opponents, and gains influence. And as Nasserist Pan-Arabism gains strength in the region, clandestine support for Gaddafi also grows. In the summer of 1967, Israel attacks Egypt, and Jordan and Syria attack Israel in the Six-Day War, resulting in a humiliating defeat for the Arab countries, sparking great outrage in the Arab world. The military in Libya expected some kind of response from the monarchy, but that didn't happen, so anti-American protests emerged. An oil strike and widespread popular discontent marked the end of King Idris of Libya's monarchy. In 1969, Gaddafi had about 7,000 men in his ranks and planned for March 12th of that year. A last-minute betrayal stopped the coup, resulting in his imprisonment and interrogation, but they got no confession from him. On September 1st, 1969, the opportunity arose again. A revolution starts, led by Gaddafi, who seizes the chance while King Idris is in Turkey. He takes power in Benghazi and Tripoli, and within a matter of hours, he gains control of the entire country. The royalist forces surrendered, and Muammar Gaddafi announced on the radio the monarchy's end and the formation of the Libyan Arab Republic. Slogan freedom, socialism, unity, inspired, or perhaps too much so, by Gamal Abdel Nasser. He begins to improvise to integrate Libya into the Pan-Arab movement. After taking power, he promotes himself to the rank of colonel. The United States and Great Britain governments do not oppose the uprising, because Gaddafi didn't get involved in the issue of the oil corporation's interests. Although Gaddafi made several arms purchases from the Soviet Union, his Muslim creed, like the Arab socialism movement, despised communism. Gaddafi's revolution replaced the monarchy with a council of revolutionary commanders, made up of about 10 of Gaddafi's closest collaborators. But neither Gaddafi nor his 12 friends knew how to run a country, so they asked Gamal Abdel Nasser to assist them. Nasser sent the young 27-year-old colonel almost as a formality. Arrogant and naive, he charged them for his advice, while in his inner circle he spoke of them with disdain and mockery. The revolution imprisoned and persecuted the monarchists, expropriated their properties, kidnapped some of their women and children, and gradually eliminated the tribal system of government in the remote regions. Inspired by nationalism, he expelled every American, British, and Italian who had nothing to do with the oil industry and for the moment refrained from interfering with that oil sector, because he knew that among the Libyans there were no professionals capable of taking control of an industry like that, which brought in most of the country's income. In September of 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser died of a heart attack, and the young Colonel Gaddafi was left without a mentor. But instead of getting discouraged, he took the opportunity to try to prove himself on the international stage as the new leader of Pan-Arabism. By 1971, he organized 2 popular votes, but both failed due to high abstention. Libyans didn't understand or want elections because they preferred their centuries-old tribal government system instead of a socialist, election-based democracy. On April 16, 1973, Gaddafi announced a popular revolution with 5 key points. Gaddafi would solely create Libya's laws, oust the bourgeoisie from power, and form a large revolutionary militia as a paramilitary force. And, inspired by Mao Zedong, he began an Islamic cultural revolution aimed at erasing from history the traces of foreign colonization. Civilian committees in this popular revolution purged the government according to Islamic Sharia law. And he also proposed the creation of the Third International Way, a kind of uniquely Libyan fusion between Islam and socialism, which was based on the strict control of the state through the Quran and a state capitalism that Colonel Gaddafi would personally lead. Through a heavy-handed approach against opponents, political and social peace is achieved. During the following years, the government partially nationalizes the oil industry, gaining 60% control over it. An agrarian reform is promoted, an extensive social security network is developed, with public medical services and subsidized electricity distribution. Just like gasoline, bank loans, car purchases, as well as secondary and university studies are subsidized. All this amid the hardships faced by people who didn't create this system themselves. The global oil price boom allows for these high levels of public investment without having to resort to lavish foreign loans. This improves Libyans' living conditions, makes the economy more dynamic, and increases per capita income. In 1979, he published the famous Green Book, a roadmap for the international revolution, where he presents his solutions for the issues of democracy, the economy, and social organization. Many in the Arab world look at this with disdain. There, he proposed a stateless society under his leadership, governed by a variation of the tribal system Libyans had used for thousands of years. Accused of paving the way for tyranny by opposing groups, Libyan intellectual students protest and are harshly repressed by his paramilitary groups. Strict surveillance and punishment of dissent continued as the norm, already typical of most governments in the region. By March of 1979, Gaddafi gives himself the grandiose title of brother leader and dissolves the Council of Comrades who accompanied him in the coup against the king, Idris. He closes media outlets, controls the judiciary, and appoints judges loyal to him. By the 1980s, almost all of the Libyan state's revenue came from the extraction and sale of hydrocarbons. With that money, he builds hospitals, schools, universities, and a housing program for the people. Over the years, the 1980s saw hostile policies against small business owners. He bans private commerce in 1984, and he puts all food distribution in the hands of a state-run network of food markets, which makes access to food difficult and leads to the emergence of black markets that the authorities crack down on. It was common to see people arrested and photographed with bags of flour and loaves of bread, accused of being smugglers. It was also during this time that construction began on one of the largest irrigation projects in the world, the Great Man-Made River, which supplies water to the desert regions of Libya. With abundant oil revenues, Libya manages to accumulate large gold reserves and becomes one of the most influential countries in Africa with these gold and silver reserves. Already after the year 2000, Gaddafi leads one of the most significant proposals, which, according to some analysts, was one of the main factors for foreign forces to support the rebels in his overthrow. The proposal was the creation of a new African currency to replace the United States dollar and the French franc for commercial and oil transactions in Africa. This new currency, the gold dinar, would be backed by the gold standard and not by the fiat money standard of the dollar. Nicolas Sarkozy, president of France, a country with a strong presence in Africa, even called the Libyan government a threat to the financial security of the world. Leaked emails from Hillary Clinton showed that for the United States and French governments, these abundant gold reserves were a cause for concern, along with the management of Libya's oil reserves. But we'll come back to this later. Back to the 70s and 80s. Driven by Pan-Arabist, Pan-Africanist, and anti-Western views, Gaddafi backed African leaders such as Jean Bedel Bokassa in the Central African Republic and Idi Amin in Uganda. But it didn't stop there, because he also decided to get involved in the Arab-Palestinian conflict, providing money, weapons, asylum, and other logistical support to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by George Habash and his envoy Carlos the Jackal. He also mingled with the Palestine Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat and financed Islamist and anti-Western movements, like the Irish Republican Army, the Italian Red Brigades, and the Baader-Meinhof gang from East Germany. The former monarchy of Iraq was an Islamist regime where women were restricted to traditional roles as outlined by the Quran, while Gaddafi's government, although also based on Islam, sought to make some changes to this. Equality before the law and equal pay for men and women are approved in certain areas. In 1972, marrying girls under 16 was penalized, and marriage required the woman's legal consent. For years, he maintained a squad of female bodyguards called the Revolutionary Nuns. Gaddafi claimed that the use of female guards demonstrated his devotion to feminism. Others, however, said that he believed Arab men would not shoot at these women who protected him. By 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States marked a change in that country's foreign policy toward many countries, and Libya was no exception. Washington and Tripoli's hostility was clear. Reagan called Gaddafi a mad dog of the Middle East, and Gaddafi mocked Reagan's Hollywood past. Libya's hostility toward Israel and its strategic importance in Africa and the Middle East for Israeli and United States interests. Washington imposes embargoes and sanctions on the Libyan regime, restricts the movements of Gaddafi's diplomats in New York, and closes the American embassy in Tripoli. Gaddafi evades the sanctions by selling oil to Europe and fills the pockets and campaigns of French and Italian leaders, something he did well into the 2000s. And on April 5th, 1986, a bomb goes off in a West Berlin nightclub frequented by American soldiers. Investigations found evidence that allegedly the Gaddafi government was behind it. On April 15, 1986, Ronald Reagan ordered the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, destroying palaces, military sites, and the defenses of a colonel who narrowly survived. Gaddafi believed that the bombing of his country would spark solidarity with him in the Arab world, but the Arab world stood by and did nothing. On his side, December 21, 1988, a Pan Am plane that took off from London exploded 45 minutes after takeoff, causing hundreds of fatalities. By November 1991, 2 Libyan terrorists were accused of being the alleged perpetrators who planted the bomb on this plane, and the United States and the United Kingdom demand that Gaddafi hand over the accused, but he refuses. And in 92, the United Nations Security Council imposes new tough sanctions on Libya, although it does not ban its oil sales. So with few goods and services entering the country, tremendous inflation breaks out, and Gaddafi cuts the salaries of all public employees except for himself and his family. The 90s were terrible for Libya, and the discontent against Gaddafi kept building up. But it would take at least 10 more years before it became a threat to the government. Military purges were constant, and Islamist groups were organizing both inside the country and abroad to conspire against the colonel, who displayed extravagant behavior. By the late 90s, Gaddafi had eliminated most of his opposition. He had also dealt with the Islamist jihadists in his region. So he decides to hand over the terrorists responsible for the plane attack to be tried in The Hague in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. Amid a small economic boom, foreign investment returns to the country. And in 2003, he accepts state responsibility for the attack and decides to pay millions of dollars to the families of the victims. At the beginning of the 2000s, George W. Bush arrives at the White House, and the United States intensifies its war policy in the Middle East. Bush seeks to dismantle Gaddafi's arms race. He agrees to remove his anti-aircraft defenses in exchange for foreign investment. Around that same time, Gaddafi's son, Saeed al-Islam Gaddafi, carries out a series of reforms to improve the regime's image in front of the world. All the while, his family and the ruling elites led ostentatious lifestyles. They had villas and beach houses, drove luxury vehicles, and held parties in tents in the desert with artists like Mariah Carey, Nelly Furtado, Usher, Enrique Iglesias, and Beyoncé. In a land of family clans, Gaddafi relied on his sons and relatives, placing them in key positions in industry and government. But the revolution against Gaddafi didn't start in Libya, but in Tunisia. In 2010, when protests organized through social media overthrew the Tunisian government. Then the discontent spread to Egypt, ending the regime of Hosni Mubarak. And then Gaddafi felt threatened by what became known as the Arab Spring, which arose from the discontent of many people against their governments. At the same time that they were receiving significant support from internal groups trained and financed by Western powers, Gaddafi tried to appease his opponents, offered reforms, and released political prisoners, but those measures came too late. On February 15, 2011, a series of arrests against Libyan opponents triggered popular unrest. Benghazi, Tripoli, and the rest of the country rose up against the government. So many years under the regime earned him many opposing groups that were about to erupt. By the end of February 2011, Libya was in civil war. The rebels formed a revolutionary council in Benghazi and received support from the United States and NATO, which imposed a no-fly zone over Libyan territory. Thus, the repressive power of Colonel is minimized. With the approval of the United Nations, NATO enters Libyan territory, trains, and helps the Libyan rebels and carries out joint offensives against the Gaddafi government. This multinational military operation is approved under the pretext of protecting Libyan civilians. Leaked documents and analysts from that time indicate it was really about protecting geoeconomic interests tied to the petrodollar's dominance and managing Libyan oil. On August 20th, 2011, the rebels took Tripoli and Gaddafi fled with a convoy to Sirte, his hometown. Gaddafi's downfall happened in multiple stages. On one hand, uprisings in the east of his country. On the other, battles for coastal communication routes. Also the bombings by Lotan, the sieges of Misurata and Zavilla, the fall of Tripoli, and finally, the bloody battle in the city of Sirte, his hometown. In the days after the rebels took Tripoli, the rebels dramatized their triumph in front of the visible symbols of Gaddafi's power, which they iconoclastically detonated and celebrated. In front of its flames, they replaced the green flag with the tricolor of King Idris. On October 20, 2011, in the fall, Gaddafi's nomadic convoy, which was moving from place to place seeking refuge, was detected by a NATO drone and bombed, leaving the convoy unusable. So Gaddafi and his allies flee on foot to seek shelter. In a nearby drainage pipe, the rebels attack what's left of the convoy and find Muammar Gaddafi hiding in a pipe. They drag him, beat him, and show him to those present, while he begs for his life. Attendees used social media to share his final moments before dying from a shot to the temple at the hands of the same rebels, ending 4 decades of his rule. His body was then displayed to the public for 2 days. Gaddafi warned his death would lead to jihadists and civil wars in Libya, which is what happened. Gaddafi's death didn't change Libya, just as past events hadn't either. Its fate has been dictated by foreign powers since ancient times. What the Romans, Ottomans, Italians, British, and later NATO have decided. With the physical disappearance of Gaddafi, another crisis would arrive, marked by the conflict between the rebels and the Islamist factions. Then, the threat of the Islamic State and the lack of governance in a region full of tribal conflicts. Today, Libya remains a failed state with no signs of stability, while the memory of Gaddafi in that region is becoming increasingly blurred. Gamal Abdel Nasser was born on January 15, 1918 in Bakos, Alexandria, a year before the 1919 Egyptian Revolution. His father, a postal worker, and his mother, a housewife, lived in a lower middle-class home in that city. Egypt, once home to history's longest-lasting empire, was under military occupation then. Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1982. Gamal Abdel Nasser, who rose from humble beginnings to lead Egypt, learned much from his family and upbringing. Everything he needed to rise in a society where origins and castes were still important factors for social advancement and success. Nasser spent the first years of his life in a country where unrest, riots, disturbances, and turmoil were everyday occurrences. For decades, Egyptians had been asking to be governed by their own people, until the popular and violent protests that erupted during the Egyptian Revolution of 1919 brought them to a head. 40 years of British occupation ended in 1922 with the semi-independence of Egypt, after the establishment of the Kingdom of Egypt, a puppet monarchy of the British, who also refused to leave the strategic Suez Canal, which remained under their control. Interested in politics since he was a teenager, Nasser would protest in the 1930s, being arrested and released on bail in 1934. He later joined paramilitary forces in 1935 and took part in the protests the following year. By 1937, Nasser enrolled in the military academy, which had started accepting students from humble backgrounds like him. At that institution, he began what would become a long, prominent career. At the academy, everyone in his circle shared his views on Egyptian nationalist government. These were the main ideas for young people then. Nasser read the Quran and biographies of Muhammad's descendants and companions. He also studied military figures from around the world, such as Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, Napoleon Bonaparte, Otto von Bismarck, Garibaldi, and Winston Churchill. He also befriended Abdel Hakim Amer and Anwar Sadat, who later became his government advisors. With his charisma, intelligence, and leadership, he passed through the various courses and graduated with honors, distinguished by his merits, with a group of officers who admired him. After the academy, he was sent to different places for military duties, first to Mankabat, then to Khartoum, Sudan, Cairo, and later was assigned as an instructor at the military academy. His nationalist aspirations grew even more passionate after the Abdeen Palace incident in 1942, in which the British surrounded the palace of the Egyptian King Farouk to force him to demand the resignation of the Egyptian Prime Minister, Hussein Siri Pasha, in favor of Mustafa el-Nahas. Mustafa el-Nahas was the man the United Kingdom considered useful for their war efforts against the Axis powers during the World War. The British ambassador Miles Lamson even entered the palace armed and at gunpoint demanded that King Farouk do the same. His punishment is bombing, arrest, and exile. The threat worked because that young 22-year-old king did everything the British demanded of him. Nasser viewed this as a clear violation of Egyptian sovereignty and formed a group of nationalist officers to seize control of the country. And on a personal level, Nasser had married Taya Qasim. Following the United Nations declaration dividing Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, the State of Israel gained official recognition. This marked what would be Nasser's first formal combat experience, which took place in 1948 in the context of the Israeli war in Palestine. What began as a skirmish between armed groups of Jewish fundamentalists going from village to village expelling Muslims ended up in a full-scale war. And that war unified the Arab countries against the newly formed Zionist state. In a war of attrition that killed thousands of Arab soldiers and left many wounded, mutilated, and traumatized. King Farouk was perceived as the main leader of the Arab world in a conflict that was seen by most of the region as the aggressive takeover by a hostile foreign elite of territories that were naturally Arab. Thus, Egypt committed itself to the war effort, but they severely underestimated the Israeli resistance. And despite Egyptian air superiority, they were quickly pushed back. Gamal Abdel Nasser fought in that war as an officer in the 6th Infantry Battalion. He saw firsthand the poor operational readiness of Egyptian soldiers, who suffered casualties from their superiors' poor strategies. Surrounded, sick, and with faulty equipment, Nasser and his men. About 4,000 men are fighting a war of attrition in Fallujah, north of Gaza. Managing to hold their position until they were surrounded by Israeli forces and forced to surrender after days of waiting for reinforcements, Nasser and his men were detained by the Israelis. And it was only through mediation between Cairo and Tel Aviv that he and the other prisoners were released. That war pushes him to intensify his efforts in Egypt's nationalist struggle. And after the revolution in Syria, agitator movements actively begin in the army. But those movements were detected by the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister, who arrest Gamal Abdel Nasser and interrogate him without managing to make him confess anything. Convinced of his loyalty and careful not to antagonize the army, they set him free, and for 2 years, Nasser continued recruiting, organizing, and conspiring. After the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty on the Suez Canal was ratified, an important navigation point under British control, which served as the gateway for trade with the Middle East and Asia. Egyptian nationalists believed that the administration of that canal should be in the hands of their country's citizens because it was on their territory, and the canal was built with Egyptian labor. In protest of the treaty, Nasser and his group launched a campaign of political assassinations targeting generals and members of the ECB government. But things went very wrong when Nasser and one of his collaborators, trying to kill a general with automatic weapons by intercepting a vehicle, opened fire on the official car and failed to take out the general. Instead, they wounded several innocent bystanders and killed a woman who happened to be there at the wrong time. That incident deeply affected Nasser, who avoided such activities for the rest of his life. What was about to happen would alter Egypt's history. July of 1952. In the context of tensions and discontent with the British, Nasser takes the opportunity to rally all his followers with speeches, writings, and addresses centered around his ideas of national government. And at the same time, the security forces were getting closer and closer to uncovering Nasser's clandestine military movement. When the authorities decided to go after Nasser and his followers, he decided to activate his plan. And the cells he had infiltrated throughout the public administration took over police stations, barracks, ministries, and other offices to prevent the arrests. Quickly and without bloodshed, in a takeover that took only a few hours to consolidate. Nasser was clever enough to talk to the Soviets and Americans about his plans so that these powers would not interfere, assuring them that the new government would not attack their commercial interests. But it was not Nasser who formally took power. Instead, he had his followers put General Mohammed Naguib in charge. Naguib held more prestige and seniority in the military than Nasser, who chose to remain behind the scenes. Thus, the Arab Republic of Egypt was founded. After taking power, they exiled King Farouk. They formed a revolutionary command council and assigned tasks to the government, to a civilian cabinet to present a better image to public opinion. Faced with the reforms imposed by the Revolutionary Command Council, the civilian cabinet rejects them for being too radical in their implementation. This issue upsets Nasser and his officers, so the following year they ban all political parties and appoint Nasser as the head of the only political party that is not outlawed. Naguib tries to distance himself from Nasser, creating discord that would eventually remove him from his position. On February 25, 1954, Naguib announces his resignation, and 2 days later Nasser has him arrested. 3 days later, there are skirmishes in the barracks between forces loyal to Naguib and Nasser's officers, which quickly end after armed intervention. And then, on March 5th, Nasser begins to rule by decree, until in November of that year, he formally assumes the presidency of the Revolutionary Command Council. After having purged the armed opposition, executed the communists, and imprisoned much of the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, who had even tried to assassinate him in an attack just a month earlier. Gamal Abdel Nasser is the new president of Egypt. He carries out developmental reforms based on promoting the country's infrastructure, industrialization, and boosting economic development through the state. He also follows a Pan-Arabist policy focused on Arab unity, and also as a way to extend Egyptian influence beyond its borders and bring other countries to his cause. Nasser becomes the first major global figure of the anti-colonial and anti-monarchist Arab movements to come to power. In a region that, after World War II, was still under the direct or indirect control of external powers. Hussein in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, the Syrian Revolution, and other processes that followed in the coming years all look to the revolution of Gamal Abdel Nasser as a reference. On the international front, Nasser made secret contacts with Israel in 1954, but he came to the conclusion that peace with that country would not be possible because he saw the leadership in Tel Aviv as expansionist and disdainful toward the Arabs. That same year, after a conference in Indonesia and visits to Pakistan, Burma, Afghanistan, and India, Nasser and regional leaders like Yossi Broz Tito decided to create the Non-Aligned Movement, a position of neutrality toward the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This further boosts his international and national prestige. That prestige helped him draft a constitution the next year, tailored to his needs, which he put to a referendum and won overwhelmingly, boosting his popularity. It gives women voting rights, bans sex-based discrimination, and protects women's workplace rights. He dissolves the Council of Commanders of the Revolution, and its members shed their uniforms to assume civilian ministerial roles. But the government and Nasser's policies clashed with the geopolitical goals and commercial interests of France and the United Kingdom, who looked down on Nasser's support for the revolution. In Algeria, the rejection of the British-made Baghdad Pact, the recognition of Mao's China, and the purchase of weapons from Czechoslovakia. His policy of neutrality, which emerged from the Non-Aligned Movement, and his support for the Arab socialist revolutions that were brewing in the Middle East and Africa. As a result, the United States and the United Kingdom had the World Bank refuse to fund the construction of a key dam in Egypt, which was central to Nasser's project. And Nasser, in retaliation, he decides to nationalize the company that managed the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956, saying that with this act, the construction of the dam would be financed. He criticizes the unfair terms by which the British company, the canal, paid dividends to the Egyptian government and raises salaries for Egyptians working there. With the decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, a crisis begins in which the United Kingdom and France are greatly affected. The United Nations Security Council passes a resolution backing Nasser's decision, provided ship passage was respected. However, by October 1956, the Egyptians found themselves invaded by the Israelis, who crossed the Sinai Peninsula and took over Egyptian bases and military posts. And within a few days, British and French planes bombed the Egyptian air bases adjacent to the canal. Nasser ordered his forces to withdraw from the Sinai to strengthen the defense of the canal. He feared the Israeli tanks would unleash all their artillery. The fight was tough. 2,000 Egyptian soldiers died at the hands of Israeli bullets and fire. 5,000 soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. And Nasser's advisors suggest that he surrender, but he refuses, gives weapons to the civilian population, and organizes militias to fight. Meanwhile, the United States government under Dwight Eisenhower disapproves of the Israeli, French, and British invasion and calls for United Nations intervention. By December's end, without results or support from other powers, most of the invading forces withdraw from Egyptian territory, except for the Israelis who stayed there until March. In 1957, they released the detainees after executing some. Nasser responds with a civil service reform, restricts the civil liberties of the Jews, and forces several of them into exile, and confiscates their properties. In April, the Suez Canal opens its doors again, now under Egyptian control. Nasser's position strengthens, as the invasion seemed like a failed attempt to overthrow him from a propaganda standpoint. By mid-1957, Nasserist Pan-Arabism dominated Arab world ideology. Egypt's sole concrete regional ally was Syria. In September that year, the Turks gathered troops at the Syrian border as part of a Baghdad-packed plot to overthrow Syria's government. Nasser sends troops to defend Damascus's government, boosting his regional prestige. As political instability grows in Syria, the idea arises that Syria and Egypt should unite as a single nation-state. Nasser. Initially, the idea is rejected due to economic disparities, lack of territorial contiguity, and Syria's history of interfering in other countries, as well as the deep social divisions among the Syrians. But in 1958, the Syrians make him change his mind because they stoked his fear that Syria would fall into the hands of the communists. An unprecedented 20th century experience. By the 1st of February, Egypt and Syria merge into the United Arab Republic. As president, Nasser visits Damascus and is welcomed by large crowds. But those who thought that Nasser would use the Ba'ath Party, the ruling party in Syria, as an ally to govern the United Arab Republic were mistaken. Because Nasser places his followers in the Syrian police and military intelligence, he disbands the political parties in Syria, including the ruling Ba'ath Party, and gives each of Syria's provinces 2 governors. And although Nasser allows the Ba'athists to hold positions of power, they never shared those positions on equal terms. Internationally, Jordan felt threatened by this new country, and the Syrians constantly tried to destabilize that government. Iraq joined Jordan in its resistance to Nasser's expansionism, while Syria was governed by Nasser as an Egyptian province. This led the Syrians to orchestrate a coup d'etat in 1961 that demanded reforms. Although Nasser considered stopping the uprising, he let Syrians take power. Thus, after 3 years, the United Arab Republic experiment ended. Nasser then shifts his focus to his country and broadens his development plan. The modernization of Egypt advances in technology, infrastructure, and social matters. He invests in education and health, building schools and hospitals, and constructs communication routes. By May 1967, the Soviets give false reports to Nasser that Israel was preparing to act offensively against Syria and Egypt. Nasser responds by massing forces at the Sinai border, occupying United Nations positions in Sharm el-Sheikh, and forming a defensive alliance with Jordan, already allied with Iraq. To deploy troops and tanks, Syria also amasses troops and tanks on its border. Israel's radio signal intelligence operators notice the military movements. In a joint operation, the Arab nations decide to invade Israel, but the Israeli counterattack was overwhelming in what became known as the Six-Day War, resulting in a humiliating defeat for the Arab armies and Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. After defeat, Nasser replaces the armed forces commander and, remorseful, admits his loss to the nation. In his final presidential years, Nasser appoints himself commander of the armed forces, president, and prime minister. He removes the military from government and aims to dismantle military intelligence, which had failed him in Syria and during the Six-Day War with Israel. He tried to eliminate this obstacle by supplying weapons and money to Al-Fatah, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement led by Yasser Arafat. This movement wages a war of attrition with thousands of varied attacks on Israel. The Israelis respond with heavy artillery against these Palestinian groups, resulting in a new crisis of Arab-Palestinian refugees. By 1970, at the end of an Arab League summit in September, Nasser suffers a heart attack. He is treated by doctors, but dies a few hours later at the age of only 52, surrounded by his close collaborators, his wife, and his children. After his death, the Arabs went into shock and his funeral was massive, with more than 5 million people in the streets. A funeral procession 10 kilometers long, accompanied by soldiers, tanks, and an aerial parade. Nasser's legacy was Egyptian independence, the end of British influence, and the establishment of a developmental dictatorship under his leadership, with ideals of social justice as a prerequisite for a liberal democracy that never came to be consolidated. He developed infrastructure, education, culture, social welfare, and ended feudalism, holding his country back. All this happened while civil, political, and religious freedoms were restricted, and with an extremely repressive police state and a relatively unstable economy, subject to the ups and downs of geopolitics. However, his figure as an inspiration for Arab nationalist movements remains relevant to this day. Thanks a lot. Hope you enjoyed the video. This way, you can access websites that are blocked, protect your information in an increasingly digitalized era, and access a much wider catalog of series, documentaries, and movies all over the world. A perfect and risk-free deal.